All right, hello everybody. Welcome back once again to another class of English 372. Got a good lecture geared up for you today. We're going to shift gears a little bit. We've been spending the past few classes talking about linguistic anthropology and its similarities and differences from sociolinguistics or anthropological linguistics and kind of teasing these things apart. Today we're going to take a step away from that and we're going to look at something a little different from the year. We're going to look at a topic known as language policy and planning, LPP. And we're going to use a lot of the terms and a lot of the ideas and concepts that we've learned over the course of the semester to tease apart some of what's going on in the undercurrent of this language policy and planning scene. We're going to be using ideas like indexicality that we've been using all semester long, but also ideology is going to feature fairly heavily in this topic. Cool. So let's jump right in without further ado. Let me double check to make sure everything's recording reasonably and my technology is all as it should be. It seems to be. So great. Let's keep going. So to start off this talk, we're going to differentiate a couple different types of language planning. We're going to talk about two different types. The first type we're going to talk about is status planning. And status planning is where there is an attempt, whether successful or not, to change the status, that's what it's called, status planning, to change the status of a language or the function of a language, right? So you don't actually change any of the linguistic material itself, the words, the structures, the sounds, etc. They don't change. What you do change is where the language is used and how it's perceived. Those are two big components. So a classic, probably the classic move in status planning with languages is raising a language to the status of a national language, right? So many countries have national languages declared. Some one, some many. Up to, I don't remember how many South Africa has, but it's something like 17, perhaps. Fact check me on that, somebody please. It's a lot. So national languages is a status that can be granted to a language, and that has real effects, right? So in some ways that doesn't change the language itself. That's very true, whether it's a national language or not, but it does have real practical effects that can be seen, right? So it affects practical things like where it gets used. Is it the language of education? Is it the language of government, etc.? And it also changes the perceptions of that language as a prestige language. And as we've talked about this whole semester, the way a language is seen, or the way a language variety is seen, affects the way that its speakers are seen. That's the indexical connection. So by elevating the status of a language, you also elevate the status of its speakers through indexicality. Bam. That's status planning. Hopefully that makes sense. And we're going to contrast that a little bit with what's called corpus planning. And this is where you do actually change something about the language itself, right? This is where you change the words, the sounds, you exert or attempt to exert some sort of control over the linguistic forms themselves. That's called corpus planning, and that's kind of a different thing, but they both fall under this heading category of language planning and policy. Cool. So I want you to take before we dive in, we're going to be looking at a lot of different case studies of this. We're going to look at the United States, but we're also going to look at places like Russia and Kenya and Europe, Kazakhstan, things like that. But before we dive into those case studies, I want us to spend just a minute, just a little bit of time, asking my favorite question to ask in this class and in every class, possibly in life, which is the why. Why? Why do people do this? Ask the why question. What are the goals? What are the reasons that people engage in language policy planning? Two questions actually here. Who does it? Who who makes these decisions, who engages in language policy and planning, and why do they do it? And we can differentiate these things possibly between the two types of language planning, between status planning and corpus planning. Do they have similar goals or do they have different goals? So if you're following along with this on the YouTube video, feel free to pause it here and give yourself a little ponder time. We're going to keep going for time purposes, but think this through. Why do people do this? There's a bunch of different reasons. And I do think they tend to, not definitively, but each of these two different types of language planning does have slightly different goals, typically. So some ideas that we'll be thinking about and talking about as we go through these case studies are with status planning. Nationalism is a really big reason for this. That national language thing that I talked about, and national unity through language. Using language as a cultural lever to get something that you want out of your population, typically at a national level, because again, why national, why not like state or community or etc., is because who's making these decisions? Government officials, typically, especially with regards to status planning. It's often higher-ups in the government, so thus nationalism becomes important there. Not that it can't happen at the state level or even an organization level, that can happen too. And nationalism's good next-door neighbor here in the United States is cultural assimilation, and we'll look at that. That's the trying to change people to a certain way, whether that's explicitly or implicitly, assimilating people into whatever culture you have, whatever mainstream culture you're after. Those are two big pillars of status planning in terms of goals. With corpus planning, there's other things going on there. Why might we want to change different aspects of our language? Say English or whatever other language you speak. Why might we seek to change things about it? One strong argument that often comes up when we're talking about corpus planning, and maybe this is, if you spent some time thinking about this on your own, this may have been one of the reasons that you came to, it often is a functionality argument, that corpus planning can increase the functional utility of language. Again, language, one of its primary functions there being for communication. There's a sense in which it is seen that, it is perceived that, we'll talk about the reality of this situation later, but that it's perceived that corpus planning can improve this communicative ability of language. How so? Well, think about a place with a lot of different dialects, right? A bunch of different dialects, some of which are bordering on mutual unintelligibility. A corpus planning standardization of the language can improve how well people understand each other. That's a good baseline understanding of that sort of argument, this style of argument. You see this at a bunch of different places. If we have an organization, we'll do you one better here, we'll shift to France for a second. If we have an organization like the Language Academy in France, which prescribes how everyone should speak, down to a word-by-word level, you should use this word instead of that word, then understanding will be flawless across the population. Does that work? Well, you're right to be a little bit skeptical if you are, but regardless of the efficacy, we're worried about the goals. What do people think they're trying to do when they're doing this corpus planning? Other reasons, sticking in France with that language academy that prescribes language use of the French language within France, there's a motive of linguistic purity here as well. And we'll see that as its own ideology. This ideology of linguistic purity as a value, as an asset to a people or a country or whatever group we're talking about. Linguistic purity has to do with borrowing words. So across many languages, this is there's contact between languages, and we borrow words for things that we don't have, right? So for various food things, this is really easy to see. We didn't have a word for pho before pho made its way to the United States, and so we borrowed that word along with the item, pho. That is against linguistic purity, because now we have a foreign word within the English language that we all know, right? And so there are institutions, again, the classic one being the Linguistic Academy in France, that tries to replace these borrowed words with native words. So with native French words, to resist English borrowing into French, or to resist German borrowing into French. It will prescribe you shouldn't use that borrowed term, you should use this term instead. Sometimes those terms, when they don't exist in French, have to be coined. They have to be coined in the sense they have to be created specifically for that purpose, so that we don't use that borrowed. And lastly, we'll think about controlling indexical associations. So by dictating the various forms and terms of the language, we can use that as a tool, kind of an insidious tool, to shift people's perceptions on what's going on in language. Spent longer on that than I thought I would. We'll get into many of these as we go, but that's a quick rundown of some of the why questions within language policy and planning. So let's take a look at some case studies. We're going to start off with the United States in the case of the indigenous languages of America, not the Americas, although to a certain extent this does go for the Americas as well. Here in the United States, there was a practice that we can see as a language policy and planning move, which was a boarding school and residential school system for Native children, for indigenous children. And this was taking place from the 18th, I should say actually to the mid-20th century, although primarily from the 18th to the mid-19th century. The last one did close in 1973. We're going to take a look at what this practice entailed, and then we're going to come back to that date. And I hope you will share in my shocked face emoji reaction to that date of 1973. What was going on in these boarding schools is they would take indigenous children away from their families, away from their communities of practice, and they would send them off to a school where they would indoctrinate them with Western culture. So they would change their clothing completely. They weren't allowed to, their clothes were actually often burned, and they were forced into these uniforms. You can see some examples of those uniforms on the right. Oh, I'm covering them up a little bit, but that's okay. They were forced to take a Western name. So, a Western name was forced upon them, and they were not allowed to speak their native languages anymore, their indigenous languages anymore, but were instead forced to speak English. Any going against these, any rebuttals in terms of clothing, name changes, or speaking a language other than English was punished, often harshly and violently. Excuse me, sorry about that. So that's what happened at these residential schools. They were trying to culturally assimilate them into Western culture. And these were practices that were going on not just in the United States, they took places in other areas as well, such as Russia and Australia. We'll talk about Russia a little bit later on today. Now, think about that in context with the last one closing in 1973. These children were taken and forced to go through these traumatic experiences as children, which intentionally dissociated them from their families and from their culture. It was intentionally trying to strip away that cultural identity that they were born into and replace it with this Western one. What often happens, and maybe we'll watch some videos in our live synchronous one or possibly even on Friday, is that people feel torn then, that they don't belong anywhere. They're children in between, stuck in between these communities that don't really have a place in either. The disassociation with their cultural heritage is often unfortunately successful. Not always, but in many cases was successful, where they don't speak their native language anymore, and they don't identify as being maybe indigenous in the same way that they would have otherwise. But at the same time, they're also not white. as seen by larger societies, right? Again, so they fit that in-between spot, which is really tough on anybody, and especially having these traumatic experiences as a child is just awful. And these children, right, with this happening as recently as 1973, are still alive today, right? They're not even particularly old. These are people in their 50s, right? These are adults that are still affected by this. We're still feeling not the indirect ramifications of this, but the direct ramifications of this practice in the United States. And that's nuts. That's absolutely horrifying. And yeah, maybe we'll watch a little bit more on this as we go. So what's going on here? Why is this practice taking place? Ideologically, let's think about this in terms of linguistic ideology. Why? Why? And again, pause the video here if you want to think about it. This is a good pausing spot for reflection of what's going on behind this practice. I'm going to highlight at least two underlying linguistic ideologies that are showing themselves here, and they're not nice ones, they're not fun ones, they're not pleasant ones, but they're ones that, again, we as people in the United States, regardless of whether we're citizens or not, as people in the United States, we need to see the reality of these linguistic ideologies that back up this practice, because they're not ancient history. These are, I'll argue, once I talk about them in more depth, current linguistic ideologies as well, that we still see in our society today. The first one is a fairly straightforward one. It's a cultural and linguistic ideology of cultural superiority, of Western European, American cultural superiority. And that cultural superiority, as part of that cultural complex, includes language. And we see back in the day, explicit confirmations of this ideology, right? So here's a quote from John Eglinton, who says, "It's fitting that the peasantry should have the language of a superior culture imposed on them." That's, in some ways, it's not applicable to it's applicable. It's not directly related to the indigenous boarding schools example that we were just looking at. It's actually in reference to Irish people and the replacement of the Irish language with English. But it's the sort of most succinct, in-your-face, unapologetic, wow, words today, huh? Expression of this type of ideology that I think I could find. Right? It's fitting that the peasantry should have the language of a superior culture imposed on them. Right? It's cultural superiority, right? Absolutely, cultural superiority. And so we can see that here, right? This practice was seen by Western culture in the United States, by the American government, as improvement. God, that's just foul even to say out loud, that this was improving. This traumatic experience that we were forcing upon children in the United States was improvement. Oof, it's disgusting, yeah. Right, and again, we see sort of the concepts that we talked about at the beginning of our very semester in terms of prescriptivism versus descriptivism, and this prescriptivist notion of placing moral judgments on languages, that some languages are just better than other languages, and again, whenever we talk about language, we should substitute in some sense, people. So when I say a moral judgment that languages are better, one language is better than the other one, we should hear underneath that this phrase of, and the people are better too, because that's really what this is saying, these types of ideologies are saying. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And we want to stare that head on so that we can acknowledge it and do something about it, right? Because these are disturbing ideologies. I think this is the most obvious ideology that's going on there. I think, though, I want to highlight as well a secondary linguistic ideology at play in this scenario, which is that cultural assimilation itself rides on top of this cultural ideology, which sees difference, cultural difference in this case, linguistic difference, as weakness, as vulnerability, and it sees cultural linguistic homogeneity as strength. Think about this ideology. Difference as weakness, homogeneity as strength. Do you see that playing out in the America that you live in, the America that you perceive in, or run your day-to-day business in? Difference as weakness, homogeneity as strength. I think we do. I think this is a prevalent ideology that we kind of we bump into all the time. And I want to push back against it, to be blunt. I'm not going to hold any punches here because of the harm that I think it causes people. That's my justification, if I needed one, for calling this out. I think we see, I'll kind of re-term that, out of this difference as weakness, homogeneity as strength, there rises up this idea of one nation, one language as a sort of ideal state of being. That each country, each nation should have one and only one language. That's another cultural ideology, and I think in some ways these cultural ideologies that I'm talking about are linked. All three of these. We could call this a third linguistic ideology. So we have the cultural superiority, Western European cultural superiority. We have difference as weakness, homogeneity as strength, and we have the one nation, one language ideology. And I want to present them as intertwined, as being part of this ideological complex of the United States that we find ourselves in. And we can see they're intertwining, hopefully fairly transparently, in the sense that if we have one language that's better, if Western European and thus English language and culture is better, then it's right and improvement for it to be the only one, which leads to homogeneity. Homogeneity then as strength, and which leads to one nation, one language mentality. And we see this right here's a little sticker, America, one nation, one flag, one language. I'm sure we hear this kind of talk all the time of foreign languages being devalued in the United States as a socio-cultural move towards that sort of homogeneity strength indicator. So I want to use this as a sort of I'm going to wrap that up as a case study in some ways, but I want to talk about how we got there a little bit. I want to give you a little bit of a historical background on these types of ideologies, because I think that can be illuminating as well. So we're going to dive into that, and then we'll finish up with some other case studies later. So I'm going to take you back in history, like I promised. This is to a very specific time point. This is back in the day. And it's a time in Europe, so we're traveling back to Europe back in the day, where the elite, religious and governmental elite, speaks Latin. We saw this a little bit when we were looking at mixed languages, these mixed language habits between German and Latin, and I talked about that's why this was happening. Latin is an elite language that educated individuals learn and speak and write in. And everybody else just kind of speaks whatever they speak, right? There's not like all that much else going on here. Whatever language, you speak the language of wherever you're at, essentially. And so, with regards to this people speaking whatever they are speaking, kind of naturally, without some language policy and planning going on, what you find is what are called dialect continua, a singular being a dialect continuum. I don't know if I've talked about this before, but I'll talk about it again, and if I have, you'll forgive me. A dialect continuum works like this. All right, actually, give me 1 second. It might be time for a handy dandy whiteboard to step up here. Where's my whiteboard? Oh, here it is. I'm going to talk about dialect continuum. I'm going to come over here and adjust myself, make myself temporarily gigantic. Sweet. So the idea behind a dialect continuum is that people in village A can understand people in village B. People in village B can understand people in village C. People in village C can understand D, E, F, whatever. I'm gonna write this out on the board a little bit because we're gonna mix it up. Hopefully that is clear enough. So you have these, let's say, 6 villages here, A, B, C, D, E, F, and people in this village understand this one, and people in this, I'm working on my board skills here, people in this village understand this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and E understands F. But people in village A do not understand people in village F at all. So there are little changes happening in between each of these different places, these different villages, and remember that the dots in this conception are villages. There are changes that happen between A and B, but not so much to make it unintelligible. They still understand each other. And there's differences between B and C, but again, not so much. And even those differences compounded between A and C, they can still understand each other. But once you get over here to the A to E or A to F, people don't understand each other anymore. So there's intelligibility along a line. And we find this happening pretty often in Europe and in other places as well. We find these sorts of dialect continua. So you can see that happening here from Portugal through Spain and down across to through Italy, right? All these Romance languages where everybody along this line, this is our A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever, right? Everybody in a line from Portugal down to the tip of Italy understands the next village over, but people in Portugal, in Lisbon, will not understand people in southern Italy. No mutual intelligibility. Yeah, that's the idea of a dialect continuum. And there are other ones too, from in Germany through to the Netherlands, etc. At a bunch of different places, these sorts of dialect continua exist. But this changed. Something changed this. This is still the case to some extent in Europe, but in a large, in a lot of ways, these dialect continua have been broken up. And why? We want to think about why. What happened here? Well, a couple of things happened. One is the decrease in status of Latin happened. This doesn't affect dialect continua, but is going to be relevant to our future points. So Latin loses some prestige and status, and people stop reading it and writing it, especially the church still does, people in the church, but outside of that, it stops being sort of administrative general use. And the printing press happens. It's a huge technological breakthrough in Europe, that a cultural change, right? And what this printing press does is that it standardizes, in some sense, these languages. It standardizes language in a way that it hadn't really been standardized before, because when you're printing a book, right, all these little towns along this dialect continuum speak a different variety of their language, of some sort of Romance language. What do you print? Do you print a different book for every one of these villages, A, B, C, D, E, F, such that the language in your print reflects the language directly of that town? No, of course you don't do that. That's not financially or labor-wise viable or efficient. Instead, what you do is you kind of pick a point in the middle, that will, you choose language, maybe you print in language C with the expectation that village B and A will still be able to understand that, and maybe language D will as well, and E and F can, like, whatever, screw them, they'll get their own printing or something. You standardize, because these things are hard to change. And along with these printing, it changed the educational practices to be more standard as well. So again, points were essentially chosen. I'm going to blow myself up again here. Maybe? There we go. Points were chosen, right? So say that we're going to print in B and we're going to print in language E. So B gets its own printing press, and so does E. And so what happens is that it forms these blocks where there was a continuum, a solid line. It forms blocks where these languages all read the B printed version, and these villages, not languages, excuse me, these villages all read the E printed version. So it forms them into blocks. Everybody can still understand each other, but what books you're getting changes, right? Maybe this is Spain, and this is Italy, or something like that, right? And then over time, the print materials affect your educational schema and what you teach, because you're now teaching the book versions of this to some extent. You're not teaching the village versions, and thus over generations, although you maintain some differences in dialect, the villages themselves, the language of the villages themselves begins to change. It begins to resemble more so the print that they're reading. That's sort of a naturalized process where this language is going to creep over. So in terms of language practice, C isn't here anymore. It's moved closer to B linguistically. And A isn't all the way over here anymore. It's still different, but it's moved much closer to B as well. And same, D has moved closer to E. And F has also moved closer to E. And now, where you had an evenly spaced continuum before, now you've got clusters. Now you've got these little blocks. And now it's the case that A, B, and C can understand each other over time. But even C might not be able to, it might be too far linguistically to language D to understand it anymore. So now, in place of a dialect continuum with each village having its own language that it speaks, they still do, but they become grouped under these bigger headings, and these larger order headings are languages. Like, whoa, this is really hard to write. Like, this might be the Spanish group, and this might be the Italian group. Cool. That change, that's the change from dialect continuum I wanted to highlight. A side effect, so to speak, I don't know how intentional these things were, it turns out I wasn't there back in the day. A side effect of these things is that it becomes really useful. It becomes really useful for the government to capitalize and encourage this sort of behavior, because it makes it functionally easier. Here again, see the functional goal, or rise up here. It becomes functionally easier to have everybody speak within your country, administratively speak and read and write in the same language. Easier administratively. You don't have to put out materials in each of these little villages. You just put out the one in the standard form, and you expect that your little grouping here, or your little grouping here, can understand that language. So there's a functional encouragement to this from national governments as well. This is the situation out of which we kind of get this one language, one nation ideology in Europe, and it translates over through colonization to the United States and the Americas as well. This one nation, one language ideology. Again, largely on the back of this perceived functionality. And we get quotes. It takes on a not just functional, so there's a shift as well. It takes on not just a functional tone, but also this kind of cultural heritage, ethnocentrism bend as well, where you get quotes like this from Johann Gottfried von Herder: "Has a nation anything more precious than the language of its fathers?" Where this isn't just a functional convenience anymore, but it's seen as good and right and just and important. It's imbued with value that it may not have had before. And note the singular here, the language of its father, not the languages. And note the, fathers too, not mothers. There's a lot going on within this one little quote, but we'll sidestep some of that in an effort of time here, because I'm running longer than I wanted to. Let's look beyond. Hopefully that gives us some background of this one nation, one language phenomenon that we see going on even today in 2020. Let's move back to some challenges, some other ways, some other instances, some case studies of language policy and planning. Let's look at a different continent. We've spent a lot of time talking about Europe, and I don't want to fully engage in that sort of Eurocentrism. So let's look elsewhere. We find that in Europe, the one nation, one language is extremely prevalent throughout the continent, with exceptions, of course. Switzerland is famously multilingual. I'm proud of it, but in general, we get the one language, one nation thing. Let's think instead about Africa, and let's think about, in particular, post-colonial Africa, and how this situation in post-colonial Africa is different from a European context. And as a case study of this, let's look at Kenya. Kenya got its independence in 1963 from the United Kingdom. At this time, there were 68 local regional languages spoken in Kenya. 68 local regional languages. And many people there in Kenya, true then and still true now, this isn't all that long ago, speak multiple of them. So you speak a bunch of different languages. 2, 3, 4 languages isn't uncommon out of these 68 local varieties. And so the question I want to pose to you is, what do we choose, where we are leadership now in a hypothetical situation in Kenya in 1963, and we're choosing a national language because that is a thing that we are supposed to choose, apparently. But we're choosing a national language for the country in a bid for national unity. What do we choose? What do we choose? Do we choose one of the regional 68 languages to promote as a national language? That could be a possibility, right? So a good potential would be Kikuyu as one of these languages. It's the language spoken by the first president, so it has that indexical association going for it. And it's also spoken by about 20% of the population, which is pretty hefty, actually. That's a good share. When you consider there's 68 languages. What are the problems with this choice? Problems with this choice. One of the problems is, that only 20% of the population speaks it. That's maybe not ideal. Another one of the problems is that it seems to elevate Kikuyu then as the marker of national identity, where it's not before, right? It's one of these ones. It's prioritized, what gives it the privilege over the other 67 languages spoken in Kenya, right? It's a bit of a catch there. So what else can we do? What else could we choose? What are our other options? Well, you could choose English as a national language. A quite large proportion of the popularity has at least some familiarity, if not fluency, in English, it being the colonial language. Oops, I'm too big suddenly. What are the problems with this? Hopefully those are more transparent. It's the colonizer language that this country just got independence from, so it's not African. It's not part of their identity in that sense. It's part of the oppressors, the colonizers' identity, and maybe there's some ideological or indexical distance that would be ideal to have between the colonizers and a newly independent nation. Something else is kind of the answer, actually. Kenya went with 2 national languages. They did end up actually going with English as a national language, despite its colonial overtones. And they also went with Swahili. And Swahili is an interesting choice. Not actually that many people, a very low percentage of the population spoke Swahili at the time it was raised to a national language, but it had some other benefits. It served a purpose nicely. It was not one of the regional languages spoken natively in Kenya. It's not one of the languages associated with a group or a tribe within Kenya. But it's African language, and it's seen as an African language, an African trade language. And so it strikes this balance of being neutral in terms of the regional languages, but being African. And there's some familiarity with it because it had been used on the east coast of Africa as a trade language as well. So they chose that as a second language, and the resulting linguistic situation in Kenya is thus pretty interesting. It's the case that it's very common to be trilingual, to speak 3 or 4 languages in Kenya. You speak a native regional language, you speak English, and you speak Swahili, and maybe you actually speak a second language, regional language, mother's language and father's language or something like that. So that's actually fairly common. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. A different ideology going on here. One of the reasons I want to present Kenya and post-colonial Africa in general is to highlight the differences in linguistic ideology going on here versus going on in the United States. There isn't this one nation, one language push going on in a country that has 68 regional languages, right? Like it's just not the same situation, and it doesn't carry with it the same ideologies. And we see the result of those differing ideologies in the intense and prevalent multilingualism in Kenya as opposed to the monolingual norm or perceived monolingual norm in the United States. Cool. Moving on, hopefully we'll get to a couple more examples, maybe just 1 or 2. These ones we're gonna go through a little faster, just to highlight some various aspects of language policy and planning. One aspect of language policy and planning that we haven't talked about is orthography. We've talked about in the past that spoken language is generally more centric and central to the field of linguistics, but orthography is also an important technology on top of language, so we'll talk about that. And in particular, orthography has some pretty incredible indexical associations on our planet. I don't know if it has to be that way, but it is. And we can see that in Turkey raising itself up very explicitly. So in 1928, Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish nation, changes the script of Turkish, which had been traditionally written in an Arabic script. He changes it from an Arabic script to a Roman script, to the same alphabet that English uses, this Roman script, right? In the newly formed Turkish nation. Why? What's this move? What is going on here? Why is this change in script happening? Because it's not random. This isn't. This is done extremely intentionally by Ataturk and presumably the rest of the Turkish administration at the time. Sorry for this picture. It's terrible. This is the same text written in Turkish in both cases, but the one on the left in the Arabic script and the one on the right in Roman. You can Google that to get the image in better quality. What's going on here is that Ataturk is intentionally controlling the indexical associations of the language. So whereas the Arabic script is tied indexically to a certain geographic region and also to Islam, to the religion of Islam, he's shifting that away from that indexical association and instead adapting a Roman script, which is indexed with the Western world, Western Europe, and the United States. So it's a shift in facing here, facing away from the Islam world and Muslim world and facing instead toward the Western world. It's an intentional move that's being done through corpus planning, through this change of script going on here, which is really interesting and fascinating. Okay, probably last one we'll look at for today is Russia and Russification and subsequent de-Russification. So Russia as a country starts in Europe and spreads ever eastward here across the northern, essentially half, I don't know if it's half or not, the northern portion of Asia. And as it does so, it comes into contact with a multitude of non-Russian languages, not even remotely, not even Indo-European languages, but a bunch of different language families all across this huge swath of land. So what does it do? What does it do about this? Well, it does some interesting things. One piece of the explicit Russian language policy during this expansion period is to promote regional languages, to promote what was perceived as dialects into full-fledged languages and promote those regionally. Note the difference. What you might have expected me to say is to squash other indigenous languages down and promote English in their place, which is what the United States did when expanding westward through what is now the United States, squashing indigenous populations through practices like boarding schools. They did some of that too in Russia, by the way, but they also did this promotion of regional languages. Why? Well, what they were worried about is that what would happen instead if they didn't promote these regional languages is that blocks would form where indigenous languages became the de facto national language of an area. Say this area in green here, which speaks Chukchi and Chukchi languages. Maybe they would unite under Chukchi and this Chukchi one nation, one... They projected a little bit this one nation, one language ideology onto other places and were worried that if they... if one of the regional languages rose to too much prominence as a lingua franca, as a general language in a region, that would have negative consequences on the Russian nation. So it was a divide and conquer strategy, essentially, whereby by promoting each individual language, they they encouraged Russian to be the lingua franca instead of one of the indigenous languages of the regions. So they also promoted Russian, not just individual languages, but individual languages, and then, oh, by the way, since you're using your individual language, you may want to use Russian as a lingua franca, just by happenstance, maybe. And that was reasonably successful. In the end, there was also suppression, of course, of the indigenous languages through other practices like boarding schools and through population movements, especially of Russian people throughout this. Russian people, ethnic Russians and Russian speakers throughout these indigenous lands. Some of these migrations were, population movements and migrations were willing immigrants into these areas, others were less. Some of them were forced migrations, intentionally to plant bastions of Russian ethnocentrism to combat indigenous independence in a lot of these places. Cool. There's we might talk about this later too. There's some interesting effects of when the Soviet Union breaks up and we see some de-Russification in a lot of these areas that were formerly Soviet Russia controlled. We might talk about that a little bit more on Friday. Cool. No, I'm going to cut it here. I'm going to stop. I got to stop myself. We'll pick up. We're going to finish off. I want to finish off some of this stuff on Friday, and then we're going to shift into some talking more about linguistic ideology and language activism. What a lot of these language ideologies that we've been talking about aren't pleasant ones, right? So they have negative, and by unpleasant ones, I mean they have negative consequences on people's lives, which is what we're not cool with, right? And so on Friday's class, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what the role of a linguist is in pushing back against some of these ideologies. That's what I got. So I hope we went through a lot of material here. I hope you can rewind it if something didn't make sense. And I hope more so in this class than, in a lot of these sociolinguistics lectures, but I hope you can see the concepts and the ideologies that I'm talking about, although I'm largely talking about them in a historical context. I hope you can see them in your day-to-day life. You know, when you hear people talking, either in a foreign language, you can check in on your own thoughts about how you're feeling about people talking in a foreign language, whether you're like, hey, that's great, awesome, look at that, or whether you're like curmudgeon-y about it. And when you hear people talking about other people talking about when you hear people talking about other people talking in a foreign language, it can be eye-opening to hear how they're talking about it and how they're either recreating these linguistic ideologies, again, that can be hurtful to different populations, or whether, and hopefully, they're combating these linguistic ideologies. And that, again, on Friday, we'll talk a little bit more about how we can participate in the solution. We can ourselves combat these ideologies. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I hope you guys have a great day today. We'll talk again on Friday and continue this. Your homework is also due Friday, so keep that in mind. Feel free to send me emails if you have any questions, and I'll catch you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye.